board meeting where my brothers officially voted me out of Industries happened on a Wednesday morning in late September, 3 months after our father's funeral. And I sat at the conference table in the same room where I'd attended meetings since I was 22 years old, when I'd first joined the company fresh out of business school. And I watched my older brother David, who was now acting CEO, call for a formal vote on my position as Chief Operating Officer, a position I'd held for 8 years. A position where I'd overseen operations and logistics and supply chain management for a manufacturing company that our father had built from nothing over 40 years. And David said, with that particular tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while being cruel, "Given the changing needs of the company and the board's concerns about management style, I'm calling for a vote on whether to retain her in her current role or to restructure her position." And I knew what was coming. Knew this had been planned for weeks. Knew that David and our younger brother had been meeting with board members and promising them things and painting me as incompetent or difficult or whatever story they'd invented to justify pushing me out. The vote went exactly as I'd expected. 7 votes to remove me from my position, 2 votes to keep me, and David announced with barely concealed satisfaction that effective immediately, I was no longer COO of Industries, that my responsibilities would be divided between him, and that while I would retain my shares as our father's daughter, I would no longer have any operational role in the company. And I sat there listening to this pronouncement, feeling a strange mixture of rage and relief, because I'd known this was coming. Had seen it building since the day of the funeral, when David had made comments about women not being suited for manufacturing businesses, when had suggested that having a female COO made the company look weak to clients, when both of them had made it clear they believed our father had made a mistake in promoting me. Had given me authority I didn't deserve because I was his daughter, not because I'd earned it. And now they were correcting that mistake, were claiming their rightful places as the men who should run Industries. And I was being relegated to the sidelines where apparently women belonged. I stood up from the conference table and gathered my things and walked out without saying a word, because what was there to say? They'd made their decision. They'd demonstrated exactly who they were and what they valued, and arguing wouldn't change anything. And as I walked past my old office, which David had already started moving into, I thought about all the years I'd spent building this company alongside our father. All the late nights and early mornings and weekends spent solving problems and optimizing processes and making Industries more efficient and more profitable. And I thought about how none of that mattered to my brothers, how they looked at me and saw only a woman who'd been given a position she didn't deserve rather than a competent executive who'd earned every promotion through results. And I felt something harden inside me that had been building for months, a determination that they would regret this, that they would understand exactly what they'd lost, that they would learn the hard way that dismissing someone based on gender rather than competence was a catastrophic mistake. Let me back up 6 years to when this story really began, because my removal from Industries didn't start 3 months after my father died. It started the day I joined the company and my brothers realized I wasn't going to be content with a token role, that I actually wanted to work and contribute and build something, and they'd spent 6 years trying to undermine me in small ways, questioning my decisions in meetings, taking credit for my ideas, making jokes about how our father was going soft by promoting his daughter, and I'd absorbed all of it because I'd believed that if I just worked harder, produced better results, proved my competence beyond any doubt, they'd eventually respect me. But I'd been wrong. Competence didn't matter when prejudice was involved, and my brothers had decided long ago that I didn't belong in their company regardless of what I achieved. My father had known, had seen how they treated me, and in the last year of his life he'd started having private conversations with me about the future of the company, about his concerns that David and were more interested in prestige than profit, more focused on appearing successful than actually being successful. And he'd told me more than once, "You're the one with real business sense. You're the one who understands that success comes from operations, not optics. And I worry about what will happen to Industries when I'm gone." And I'd reassured him that I'd protect his legacy, that I'd make sure the company continued to thrive. But I'd also known that David and wouldn't make that easy, that they'd see our father's death as an opportunity to seize control and push me out, and I'd started preparing for that possibility, quietly, carefully, in ways they wouldn't notice until it was too late. 6 years ago, when I'd first joined Industries, I'd also started my own investment company, a small operation that I ran on the side using money I'd saved from previous jobs and from birthday gifts, and from the small inheritance my grandmother had left me. And I'd called it Phoenix Capital because I'd liked the symbolism of something rising from ashes. And I'd started investing in tech startups and small businesses and anything that showed potential for growth. And I'd been good at it. Surprisingly good. Good enough that within 2 years, Phoenix Capital was managing $5 million in investments. And within 4 years, it was managing $20 million. And I'd kept this completely separate from my work at Industries. Had never mentioned it to my father or my brothers. Had maintained it as my private side project, because I'd known instinctively that having independent wealth and success would be important someday. Would give me leverage and options that I wouldn't have if Industries was my only source of income and identity. By the time my father died, Phoenix Capital was managing investments worth over $80 million, and I personally owned assets worth approximately $40 million. And I was considered in certain investment circles to be someone with exceptional instincts for identifying undervalued companies and helping them scale. And I'd built a network of entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and business leaders who respected my judgment and valued my input. And none of this was known to my family, who still saw me as the daughter who'd been given a job at the family business out of nepotism rather than merit. And I'd let them maintain that belief, because it had served my purposes to be underestimated, to be dismissed as not a serious threat, to move through the business world making connections and building wealth while my brothers were distracted by their own egos and their own assumptions about what women could and couldn't do. When my father had gotten sick with the cancer that would eventually kill him, I'd spent months at his bedside talking about business and life and legacy, and he'd told me things he'd never shared with David or had talked about his concerns for the company, his disappointments in his sons who'd never really understood that business wasn't about corner offices and titles. It was about creating value and serving customers and building something sustainable. And he'd said to me one day about 3 weeks before he died, "I'm going to tell you something that you need to keep to yourself for now. I've been quietly buying back shares of Industries from board members who wanted to retire or liquidate. And I now own 72% of the company instead of the 60% your brothers think I own. And in my will, I'm leaving you 40%, David 20%, 12%, because you're the one who deserves to control the company. You're the one who's actually earned it, and I know they're going to fight this, but you need to hold firm. You need to take control and run the company the way it should be run." I'd been shocked by this revelation, had asked why he hadn't told me earlier, and he'd said he wanted to wait until he was sure, wanted to watch me work and see if I had what it took to run the company. And over the past 6 years, he'd concluded that I was the only one of his children who'd actually understood business as something more than ego gratification. And he wanted to make sure I had the power to protect his legacy after he was gone, and I'd promised him I would. Had held his hand and told him I'd make him proud, and he died 2 days later knowing I'd do exactly what he'd asked. And I'd carried that promise through his funeral and through the subsequent months where David and Marcus had started their campaign to push me out. And I'd let them proceed because I'd known that the will reading would change everything, would reveal that I owned 40% of Chen Industries, and they'd have to deal with me whether they wanted to or not. The will reading had happened 2 months after the funeral, and my brothers had been confident going in, had probably expected our father to split ownership evenly or maybe give David slightly more as the eldest. But when the lawyer had read the distribution, 40% to Catherine, 20% to David, 12% to Marcus, 28% to be distributed among board members and employees through a trust, David had actually stood up and started yelling about how this was impossible, how our father would never give a woman control of his company, how I must have manipulated him or influenced him while he was sick. And the lawyer had calmly produced documentation that our father had made these decisions over a period of years, not in some last-minute deathbed revision, and that there was video testimony of him explaining his reasoning. And when they'd played that video and my father had said on camera, "I'm giving Catherine control because she's earned it, because she's the most competent of my children, because she actually understands business rather than just enjoying the perks of being an executive, and because I trust her to do what's right for the company rather than what's right for her ego. Marcus had actually gotten up and left the room, and David had sat there looking like he'd been punched. But 40% wasn't enough to control the company outright, not when David and Marcus together owned 32% and could potentially ally with the 28% owned by the board trust to outvote me. And I'd known that, had known that my father had given me the largest share but not an outright majority, and I'd assumed he'd done this deliberately, had wanted me to have to work with my brothers rather than simply overrule them. But I'd also known that David and Marcus wouldn't work with me, would spend every moment trying to undermine me and push me out. And that's exactly what had happened. They'd spent 3 months after the will reading building coalitions with board members, promising them bonuses and promotions, painting me as difficult and unqualified. And finally, they'd engineered the vote that had removed me from my operational role. And they'd thought that was the end of it, thought they'd won. Thought they'd successfully put me in my place. But they had no idea what was actually happening, had no idea that while they'd been focused on pushing me out of Chen Industries, I'd been focused on buying Chen Industries. Here's what my brothers didn't know, what nobody except my lawyer and my financial advisors knew. For the past 18 months, I'd been using Phoenix Capital to quietly purchase shares of Chen Industries from board members and minor shareholders, had been approaching people who owned small stakes and offering them premium prices for their shares. And because I'd been buying through a shell corporation that wasn't obviously connected to me. Nobody had realized that all these separate share purchases were actually one person accumulating a controlling stake. And by the time my brothers had voted me out of my COO position, I owned not just the 40% my father had left me, but an additional 11% I'd purchased through Phoenix Capital, which meant I owned 51% of Chen Industries, which meant I had majority control. Which meant my brothers had just removed me from an operational role in a company I actually owned and controlled. And I'd let them do it, had sat there and said nothing, because I'd wanted them to feel like they'd won before I revealed that they'd actually lost everything. The day after my brothers voted me out, I'd called an emergency board meeting, and I'd watched their faces when I'd walked into the conference room with my lawyer. And David had said, "Catherine, you're not a board member anymore, you need to leave." And I'd said, "Actually, I'm a board member, and I'm calling this meeting to order as the majority shareholder of Chen Industries." And I'd watched confusion spread across the room as I'd laid out the documentation showing that I owned 51% of the company. Showing all the share purchases Phoenix Capital had made over the past year and a half. Showing that every acquisition had been legal and properly documented and filed. And David's face had gone from confused to pale to red in the space of about 30 seconds. And he'd said, "That's not possible. That's fraud. You can't secretly buy shares in your own company." And my lawyer had said, "Actually, you can. There's nothing illegal about a shareholder purchasing additional shares through a properly structured investment vehicle." Catherine filed all required disclosures with the SEC. Everything was above board. She just didn't advertise what she was doing. I'd stood at the head of the conference table, the same table where 24 hours earlier I'd been voted out of my position, and I'd said, effective immediately, "I'm resuming my role as COO, and I'm also appointing myself as CEO since apparently we need new leadership." And David had said, "You can't do that, I'm CEO." And I'd said, "You were acting CEO temporarily. You were never formally appointed. And as majority shareholder, I'm now making the formal appointment and I'm appointing myself." And Marcus had said, "This is bullshit. You manipulated Dad into giving you those shares, and now you've manipulated board members into selling to you." And I'd said, "I didn't manipulate anyone. I offered fair market prices for shares that people wanted to sell. And as for Dad's distribution, you heard him explain his reasoning on video. He gave me control because I'm the most competent. And the fact that you immediately tried to push me out when you thought you could prove he was right." The board members who'd voted to remove me the day before were now looking uncomfortable, were realizing they'd made a serious political mistake by siding with my brothers against the actual majority owner of the company. And I'd looked at each of them and said, "I understand you were put in a difficult position. My brothers made you promises and assurances. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not vindictive. I'm not going to fire everyone who voted against me yesterday. But I am going to make changes. I'm going to restructure leadership. I'm going to refocus this company on operations and efficiency rather than optics and ego. And anyone who can't support that vision should consider whether they want to stay. And I'd watched several of them nod, had watched them recalculate their loyalties in real time. And I'd felt satisfaction that they were learning the lesson my brothers had failed to learn, which was that underestimating someone based on gender was a costly mistake. David and Marcus had tried to fight, had hired lawyers to challenge the share purchases, had claimed that I'd used insider information or that I'd violated some fiduciary duty. But every challenge had failed because I'd been meticulous, had followed every rule, had documented everything, had made sure that there was no legal vulnerability in what I'd done. And after 3 months of legal bills and failed motions, their lawyers had told them they had no case and they should accept the new reality. And David had finally called me and said, "What do you want? Do you want us gone? Do you want us out of the company?" And I'd said, "I want you to work with me instead of against me. I want you to contribute based on your actual skills instead of your assumptions about what you deserve. I want you to respect me as a leader instead of dismissing me as a woman. Can you do that?" And there'd been a long silence, and he'd said, "I don't know. I've spent 35 years believing that I'd run Dad's company someday, and now you've taken that away." And I'd said, "Dad took that away when he gave me control. I just enforced what he wanted, and you have a choice. You can accept reality and work within it, or you can leave and find something else. But what you can't do is continue trying to undermine me. Those days are over." Marcus had been easier to bring around. He'd never really wanted to run the company anyway, had enjoyed the prestige and the salary but not the actual work. And when I'd offered him a generous severance package plus consulting fees, he'd taken it and moved to California to start a tech company with some friends. And he'd actually called me a year later and said, "Catherine, I owe you an apology. I spent years treating you like you didn't belong at Chen Industries when the truth is you were the only one who actually understood the business. I was just coasting on Dad's success, and you were actually building success. And I'm sorry I didn't see that until you had to force me to see it." And I'd appreciated the apology, even though it had come late and probably been motivated partly by his need for my goodwill as he was building his new company. David had stayed at Chen Industries, but in a reduced role. I'd made him VP of Business Development, which played to his actual strengths, which were networking and client relations. And I'd told him, "You're good at making people like you, at building relationships, at selling the company's vision. Use those skills instead of trying to do jobs you're not suited for." And he'd resisted at first, had seen the demotion from CEO to VP as humiliating. But over time, he'd come to appreciate that I was giving him work he was actually good at rather than work his ego wanted. And our relationship had slowly improved from hostile to professional to something almost approaching mutual respect. And he'd told me about 2 years after I'd taken control, "You were right. I would have run this company into the ground. I cared more about looking successful than being successful. And you've actually grown revenue by 30% since you took over. You've done what Dad would have wanted." Taking control of Chen Industries had been satisfying, but it had also been exhausting. I'd had to restructure entire departments, had to fire executives who were loyal to my brothers, but incompetent, had to rebuild relationships with clients who'd been concerned about the leadership transition, had to prove to everyone internally and externally that a woman could run a manufacturing company not just adequately, but excellently. And I'd worked insane hours for the first 2 years. Had basically lived at the office, had sacrificed my personal life completely to make sure the company not only survived the transition, but thrived because of it. And the results had been undeniable. Revenue up 30% in 2 years. Profit margins improved by 12%. Employee satisfaction at all-time highs according to our annual surveys. Client retention at 98%. And industry recognition that Chen Industries under Catherine Chen was not just continuing her father's legacy, but exceeding it. 3 years after I'd taken control of Chen Industries, we'd started getting acquisition offers, larger companies that wanted to buy us, private equity firms that saw value in our operations, and I'd turned them all down because I'd wanted to keep the company independent, wanted to maintain control, wanted to continue building something that was mine, not just inherited. But then about 4 years after I'd taken control, I'd started thinking about an IPO. about taking Chen Industries public, and the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. We were at a size where public markets could provide growth capital, where increased visibility could help with recruiting and partnerships, where liquidity for shareholders, including me, could provide flexibility for future investments. And I'd started the process of preparing for an IPO, hearing investment bankers, getting our finances audited and structured for public company requirements, building out our board to include independent directors who'd meet listing standards. And through all of this, I'd been thinking about the board meeting where my brothers had voted me out, thinking about how they'd assumed I had no recourse, thinking about how they'd believed that removing me from operations meant they'd won. The IPO process had taken 18 months from initial planning to actual execution, and we'd filed our S-1 registration statement with the SEC, which meant all our financials became public. And I'd watched with satisfaction as business journalists and industry analysts had looked at our numbers and realized that Chen Industries under my leadership had become a powerhouse, had achieved growth rates and profit margins that were best in class. And articles had started appearing with headlines like, "How Catherine Chen transformed her father's manufacturing company into an industry leader," and "The female CEO who proved her brothers wrong." And David had called me when those articles started coming out and said, "I'm reading about our company like I'm learning about it for the first time. I had no idea you'd achieved all of this." I was so focused on being angry about being demoted that I didn't pay attention to what you were actually doing. And I'd said, "That's been the problem all along. You were focused on title and status while I was focused on results." We'd priced the IPO at $35 per share, which had valued Chen Industries at approximately $1.2 billion. And because I'd owned 51% of the company before the IPO and was selling down to 40% to create public float, I'd personally owned shares worth approximately $600 million at the IPO price, and the offering had been oversubscribed, which meant there was more demand than available shares. And on the day of the IPO, when Chen Industries started trading on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol CHEN, the stock had opened at $42 per share, 20% above our offering price, and by the end of the first day of trading, it had closed at $46 per share, which meant my 40% stake was now worth approximately $730 million. And I'd gone from being a woman my brothers had dismissed as incompetent to being one of the wealthiest, self-made female executives in our industry. The IPO celebration had been held at the stock exchange, and I'd invited my whole family, including David and Marcus, and I'd stood on the trading floor watching CHEN shares trade, and I'd thought about that board meeting 4 years earlier where I'd been voted out, thought about David's satisfied expression when he'd announced my removal, thought about how confident they'd been that they'd put me in my place, and I'd thought about my father who'd believed in me enough to give me control, who'd seen past gender to competence, who'd known that I'd protect his legacy better than my brothers ever could, and I'd wished he was there to see this moment, to see that I'd taken his company and made it something even bigger than he'd built, to see that his faith in me had been justified. At the celebration dinner after the first day of trading, David had stood up and given a toast, and he'd said, "I want to say something that's probably overdue. I spent years resenting Catherine, years believing she'd stolen something that should have been mine, years trying to undermine her and push her out. And I was wrong about all of it. Catherine is the best CEO Chen Industries could have. She's grown this company beyond anything Dad could have imagined. She's proved that gender has nothing to do with competence, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see what should have been obvious from the beginning." And the room had applauded, and I'd felt emotion well up that I'd been suppressing for years, felt validation that I'd been fighting for since the day I'd joined the company, felt like maybe finally my family saw me as I actually was rather than as what they'd assumed I should be. Marcus had flown in for the IPO celebration, and he'd pulled me aside and said, "Catherine, I've been following what you've done with the company from California, and I'm in awe. You took a regional manufacturing business and turned it into a national player. You've more than doubled revenue. You've made our father's company worth over $1 billion, and you did it while dealing with David and me trying to sabotage you. And I want you to know that I tell everyone I meet that my sister is one of the best business leaders in America, and they should pay attention to what she does. And I'd hugged him and said, "Thank you. That means more than you know." And he'd said, "I'm proud to be your brother. I'm sorry I didn't always act like it. But I'm proud of you now, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows what you've accomplished." The IPO had changed everything. Suddenly, I was being invited to speak at conferences, being interviewed by business publications, being asked to join boards of other companies, being recognized as a leader in manufacturing and in women's entrepreneurship. And I'd used that platform to talk about the barriers women face in business, about the importance of being underestimated as a strategic advantage, about how the best revenge is success so overwhelming that the people who doubted you have no choice but to acknowledge it. And I'd started mentoring young women who were trying to break into male-dominated industries, sharing my story about being voted out by my brothers and then buying my way back in with majority control. And those women would tell me, "You give me hope that I can succeed even when everyone doubts me." And I'd tell them, "Use their doubt, let them underestimate you. Build your resources and your network and your skills while they're distracted by their assumptions, and then strike when you have the leverage to win." 5 years after the IPO, Chen Industries stock had more than doubled from the initial offering price. My 40% stake was now worth over $1.6 billion, and I'd been named to Fortune's list of most powerful women in business. And I'd been approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to make a film about my story, about being pushed out by my brothers, and then taking control and growing the company to $1 billion valuation. And I'd agreed because I'd thought the story might inspire other women. And during the filming, I'd taken the crew to the conference room where the vote had happened, and I'd sat in the same chair where I'd sat when my brothers had removed me from my COO position. And I'd told the camera, "Sitting here 5 years ago, I felt humiliated and angry and dismissed. But I also felt determined that they would regret underestimating me. Determined that I'd prove them wrong so completely they'd never be able to dismiss another woman the way they'd dismissed me. And everything I've done since that day has been motivated by that determination, by the desire to show that being pushed out isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of the comeback." The documentary had premiered at Sundance and had been bought by Netflix and had reached millions of viewers. And after it came out, I'd started getting messages from women all over the world saying, "I was voted out of my family business," or "My brothers tried to push me aside," or "I was told I didn't belong because I'm a woman, and your story gave me the courage to fight back." And I'd realized that what had happened to me wasn't unique, wasn't isolated, was part of a larger pattern of women being excluded from family businesses and companies and industries that men considered their territory. And I'd started a foundation called Pushed Out, Not Pushed Down, that provided legal resources and business education and mentorship for women who'd been excluded from family businesses. And we'd helped dozens of women fight back against brothers and fathers and uncles who tried to write them out of companies they'd helped build. David had become one of my strongest advocates, had gone through something like a conversion after seeing the company's success under my leadership, and he'd started speaking at conferences about his own biases and mistakes, about how he'd almost destroyed the family business because he'd valued his ego over competence, about how Catherine had saved Chen Industries by being better at business than he'd ever been. And people would come up to him after these talks and say, "It takes courage to admit you were wrong so publicly." And he'd say, "It takes more courage to admit you were wrong to the person you wronged. My sister gave me grace I didn't deserve, and the least I can do is make sure other men don't make the mistakes I made." 7 years after the IPO, I'd stepped down as CEO of Chen Industries, not because I was forced out or because I'd failed, but because I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do. I'd taken my father's company and grown it to a $3 billion valuation. I'd proved that a woman could not only run a manufacturing business but excel at it. I'd built a legacy that would outlast me, and I was ready for new challenges. And I'd appointed an exceptional woman as my successor. Someone I'd mentored who'd come up through operations, someone who'd faced her own barriers and overcome them. And at my goodbye party, the entire company had given me a standing ovation, and David had cried and said, "You didn't just save this company, you saved me. You taught me that business is about people and results, not egos and assumptions, and I'm a better person because of what you built here." I'd used my wealth to do what I'd always wanted to do, which was invest in other women entrepreneurs. I'd expanded Phoenix Capital to manage over $5 billion, specifically focused on female-founded companies. And I'd become known as someone who invested not just money but mentorship and connections and strategic guidance. And companies I'd invested in were thriving, were growing, were proving that women-led businesses could compete with anyone. And I'd thought often about that board meeting where my brothers had voted me out, about how that moment of humiliation had led to everything that came after, had been the catalyst for me to take control and build something bigger than I'd imagined possible. 10 years after being voted out of Chen Industries, I was 56 years old and had a net worth Forbes estimated at $2.8 billion. And I'd been invited to speak at the same business school I'd graduated from 34 years earlier. And I'd stood in front of 200 MBA students and told them the story of being pushed out by my brothers, of secretly buying shares to take control, of growing the company to a $1 billion IPO. And a young woman in the front row had raised her hand and asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your brothers hadn't voted you out, if they'd just let you keep working as COO?" And I'd thought about it and said, I'd probably still be COO, probably still be working in their shadow, probably still be trying to prove myself to people who'd already decided I wasn't good enough. And that vote, that moment where they thought they were ending my career, actually freed me to claim the power I'd been afraid to claim, to take control I'd been hesitant to take, to build the company I'd been too cautious to build. So in a weird way, I'm grateful they pushed me out, because it forced me to push back harder than I would have otherwise. Another student had asked, "How do you balance being ruthless enough to succeed in business with being the kind of person you want to be?" And I'd said, I'm not ruthless, I'm strategic. There's a difference. Ruthless means harming others to benefit yourself. Strategic means planning carefully and executing effectively to achieve your goals. Everything I did to take control of Chen Industries was legal and ethical. I didn't cheat or lie or manipulate. I just worked harder and planned better and acted more decisively than my brothers expected a woman to act. And that's not ruthlessness. That's competence combined with determination. And the students had applauded, and I'd thought about my father who'd understood that distinction, who'd given me control because he'd known I'd use it strategically rather than ruthlessly, who'd trusted me to build something sustainable rather than something ego-driven. I'd been invited to the White House to receive an award for women's entrepreneurship, and at the ceremony the president had talked about my story, about being voted out by my brothers, and then taking control and building a $1 billion company, and had said, Catherine Chen represents the best of American business, not because she accumulated wealth, but because she proved that talent and determination matter more than gender and assumptions. And her work mentoring and investing in other women entrepreneurs has created ripple effects throughout our economy. And I'd stood there on the stage thinking about that conference room where my brothers had voted me out, thinking about how far I'd traveled from that moment of humiliation, thinking about how that moment had been not an ending but a beginning. I'd gone back to visit Chen Industries about 12 years after I'd taken control, walking through the manufacturing floor where I'd spent so much time in my 20s and 30s, and the workers had recognized me, and one of them, a woman who'd been there 30 years, had said, "Ms. Chen, you changed this place. Not just the business, but the culture. When you took over, there were 5 women in management. Now there are 40. You made us believe we belonged here." And I'd hugged her and thought about all the women who'd come after me, who'd benefited from the door I'd kicked down, who'd built careers in a company that used to exclude them. And I'd understood that the legacy wasn't the IPO or the wealth or the awards. The legacy was the changed beliefs, was the proof that women could succeed in spaces they'd been told they didn't belong. David had retired from Chen Industries about 8 years after I'd taken control, and we'd had lunch to celebrate his retirement. And he'd said, "Catherine, I spent most of my life believing I deserved to run Dad's company because I was the eldest son. And it took you taking control and succeeding so completely for me to understand that deserving something is about earning it, not inheriting it. And I want you to know that I tell my own children about you, about how their aunt proved that talent and hard work matter more than gender or birth order. And I tell them that if they want to be successful, they should be like you, not like the person I was." And I'd said, "David, you've become someone Dad would be proud of. You've learned and grown and changed. And that's harder than being right from the beginning. And he'd said, I had a good teacher. 15 years after being voted out of Chen Industries, I was speaking at a conference for women in business. And a woman about 30 years old came up to me after my talk and said, Ms. Chen, I'm Catherine. I'm named after you. My mother heard your story when she was pregnant with me and decided that if she had a daughter, she'd name her Catherine because she wanted her daughter to grow up knowing that women can overcome any obstacle. And I'd started crying right there in the conference center because I'd never thought about my story having that kind of impact. Never thought that parents would name their children after me because of what I'd overcome. And this young Catherine had said, my mother died when I was 10, but she'd told me your story so many times I'd memorized it. And whenever I've faced discrimination or dismissal, I think about you being voted out by your brothers and then buying your way back in. And it reminds me that being pushed down is only permanent if you stay down. And I'd hugged her and said, tell me your story. And she'd told me about joining her family's construction business and being told she couldn't work on job sites because she was a woman, and how she'd started her own construction company, and how she'd just won a contract to build a hospital that her family's company had bid on and lost. And she'd said, when I signed that contract, I thought about you signing the papers that gave you control of Chen Industries, and I understood that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just succeeding so completely that the people who doubted you can't ignore it. I'd written a book about my experiences about 18 years after being voted out, titled Pushed Out. How being dismissed made me unstoppable. And it had become a bestseller, had been translated into 27 languages, had been required reading in business schools across the country. And I'd gotten messages from readers all over the world who'd seen themselves in my story, who'd experienced their own versions of being dismissed or excluded or underestimated, and who'd used my story as inspiration to push back, to claim space, to demand respect. And the most common thing people said to me was, I thought being pushed out was the end, but your story showed me it could be the beginning. And I'd thought about how true that was, how that board meeting where my brothers had voted me out had been the beginning of everything that came after, had been the moment I'd stopped trying to fit into their vision of who I should be and started building my own vision of who I could become. 20 years after being voted out, I was 66 years old, and looking back on a career that had exceeded anything I'd imagined when I'd first joined Chen Industries as a nervous 22-year-old business school graduate. And I'd been interviewed by a documentary filmmaker who was doing a follow-up to the original documentary about my takeover of Chen Industries. And she'd asked me, what would you tell your younger self? The woman sitting in that conference room being voted out by her brothers. And I'd said, I'd tell her that this is not an ending. This is an opportunity. The brothers who are dismissing you right now are giving you the gift of clarity. They're showing you exactly who they are and what they value, and they're freeing you to become who you need to be. And 20 years from now, you'll look back on this moment not with pain, but with gratitude, because being pushed out will turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. Because it will force you to claim power you were too cautious to claim, to build wealth you didn't think you deserved, to create legacy that will outlast all of you. And the brothers who think they're ending your career are actually beginning it, are actually launching you into a version of success they can't imagine. So don't fight them right now. Don't argue. Don't defend yourself. Just walk out with dignity and start building the plan that will make them regret everything they just did. The interviewer had asked me if I'd ever reconciled with my brothers completely, if we'd ever gotten past the initial conflict. And I'd said, David and I have a good relationship now. He's done the work to understand his biases and change his beliefs. And I respect that. Respect that he didn't just apologize, but actually transformed who he was. Marcus and I are cordial. We talk occasionally. He's successful in his own right now and happy, and we've made peace with our history. But I'd be lying if I said the relationship was completely healed. There's always going to be that memory of them voting to push me out. Always going to be that awareness that they tried to destroy my career because I was a woman, and forgiveness doesn't erase memory. It just makes memory less painful. And the interviewer had said, do you think they understand the full impact of what they did? And I'd said, I think they understand that it changed all our lives. That their attempt to exclude me led to me taking full control. That their cruelty created my determination. that they essentially created the outcome they feared most, which was me having complete power over the company. And there's a lesson in that about how prejudice often creates its own consequences, how excluding people often gives them motivation to succeed beyond what they would have achieved if you'd included them. 25 years after being voted out, I was 71 years old and mostly retired from active business, spending my time on philanthropy and mentorship and writing. And Chen Industries was thriving under the leadership of the woman I'd appointed as my successor, who'd grown the company to an $8 billion valuation. And I'd received a call from David, who was now 73 and in declining health, and he'd asked me to come visit him. And I'd gone to his house and sat beside his bed. And he'd said, "Catherine, I'm not going to live much longer. The doctors are giving me weeks, not months. And I need to tell you something before I go. That board meeting where Marcus and I voted you out, that was the worst thing I ever did. Not just because it was wrong, but because it revealed who I'd become. Someone who valued his ego over fairness. Someone who used gender as an excuse to exclude competence. And I've spent the past 25 years trying to atone for that, trying to be better. Trying to make sure other men don't make the mistakes I made. But I need you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry. Not sorry because you succeeded despite us, but sorry because we tried to stop you from succeeding. Sorry that we put you in a position where you had to fight your own family. Sorry that we made you prove yourself in ways we never had to prove ourselves." I'd held David's hand and said, "I forgive you. I forgave you years ago. Not immediately, but eventually. And you need to know that what you did, as painful as it was, made me stronger, made me more determined, made me into someone I might not have become if things had been easy." And David had said, "But you shouldn't have had to become strong through pain. You should have been supported from the beginning, should have been given the same opportunities Marcus and I were given without having to fight for them." And I'd said, "You're right. I shouldn't have had to fight, but I did fight and I won. And maybe that's the point of the whole story, that sometimes barriers make us better than we would have been without them. And your opposition made me sharper and more strategic and more successful than I would have been with your support." And David had smiled and said, "Dad knew. Dad understood that you'd thrive against opposition. That's why he gave you control. He knew the obstacles would make you stronger." And he died 3 days later, and I'd cried not just for his death, but for all the wasted years when we could have been allies instead of adversaries, when we could have built something together instead of fighting over who got to build what. Marcus had called me after David's funeral and said, "We're the only ones left now. Mom died years ago and now David's gone, and I want to make sure we're okay, that whatever happened between us doesn't prevent us from being family." And I'd said, "We're okay. We've been okay for years. We made peace with our history and that's enough." And he'd said, "I think about that board meeting sometimes, about how certain we were that pushing you out was the right thing to do, about how convinced we were that you didn't deserve to be there, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd supported you instead of fighting you." And I'd said, "We'll never know, but I can tell you that the fighting made me who I am, made me someone who doesn't accept barriers, someone who finds ways around obstacles, someone who turns opposition into fuel, and I'm grateful for that even if I wish it had been easier." 30 years after being voted out of Chen Industries, I was 76 years old and had outlived both my brothers, had seen the company I'd taken over grow to become one of the largest manufacturers in the country, had watched dozens of women I'd mentored become CEOs and founders and leaders, had seen my story become a case study in business schools about strategic planning and stakeholder management and turning adversity into advantage. And I'd been asked to speak at the 30th anniversary of the documentary about my takeover, and I'd stood on stage in front of hundreds of people and said, 30 years ago my brothers voted to remove me from Chen Industries. They thought they were ending my career, thought they were putting me in my place, thought they were protecting the company from female leadership. And what they actually did was set in motion a series of events that led to me taking complete control, growing the company to a $1 billion IPO, and proving that gender has nothing to do with business capability. And I tell you this not to celebrate my brother's mistake, but to give hope to everyone who's ever been pushed out, who's ever been dismissed, who's ever been told they don't belong. Because being pushed out is not the end of your story. It's just the beginning of your comeback. And the people who push you out often give you the motivation you need to succeed beyond what anyone imagined possible. The audience had given me a standing ovation, and afterward dozens of people had come up to share their own stories of being pushed out and pushing back. And I'd listened to each story and thought about how common this experience was, how many talented people had faced dismissal and exclusion and had to fight their way back. And I'd thought about my father who'd understood this, who'd given me control because he'd known I'd face obstacles and would need power to overcome them, who'd bet on me when my brothers had bet against me, and who'd been right, and I'd wished he was there to see what I'd built, to see that his faith had been justified, to see that the daughter his sons had dismissed had become the leader he'd always known she could be. I'd written one final letter to be read after my death, a letter to young women who might face the same dismissals I'd faced, and in it I'd written, "If you're reading this, then you've probably been pushed out, dismissed, told you don't belong, and you're probably feeling humiliated and angry and defeated. And I want you to know that those feelings are valid, but they're not final. You have a choice about what comes next. You can accept the dismissal and disappear, or you can use it as fuel, as motivation, as proof that you need to build something they can't take from you. And if you choose to fight back, here's what I learned. Build resources they don't know about, create leverage they don't expect, document everything, be strategic, not emotional, strike when you have the advantage, not when you have the anger, and most importantly, understand that being underestimated is a gift. It means they're not watching you, not taking you seriously, not preparing for what you're capable of, and that gives you time and space to build the power you'll need to win." The letter continued. "And after you win, after you've taken back what they tried to take from you, after you've proved them wrong so completely they can't deny it, be gracious, be kind, be bigger than they were, because the goal isn't to destroy them, it's to transform yourself, to become someone they can't dismiss, to build something they can't ignore. And if you can do that while maintaining your integrity and your humanity, then you've truly won. Not just the battle, but the war. Not just the position, but the purpose. Not just the company, but the legacy. And that's what I hope for you, that you'll take your dismissal and turn it into your determination, that you'll take their doubt and turn it into your fuel, that you'll take their barriers and turn them into your advantages, and that 30 years from now, you'll look back on the moment they pushed you out and realize it was actually the moment they launched you into the success they never imagined you'd achieve."